Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of What the Fintech, the podcast from the team behind Fintech Futures and the Banking Technology magazine. My name is Paul Hindle, editor of Fintech Futures, and for this episode we're joined by Zac Maufe, head of regulated industries at Google Cloud. Zac, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you here as well. I mean, just to get started, we'd like to quickly let us know a bit more about yourself then and the work you're doing at Google.
Yeah, so I spent 25 years in banking, so financial services is very near and dear to me. And at Google, I run, as you mentioned, what we call the Regulated Industries Group, which includes all of the financial services flavors. So, insurance, banking, capital markets, payments, but also healthcare, life sciences, and all the flavors of manufacturing, including auto. And what I do really is I think about all the incredible technology Google has, and then how do we use that to apply it to solve problems in those industries? And that's essentially it in a nutshell.
Well, sounds great. And again, great to have you here. And thanks so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. So on the show this week, we'll be discussing topics such as cloud core modernization, as well as the impact generative AI has had on the financial services sector since it burst onto the scene a couple of years ago. In particular, we'll look to discuss the challenges and key points to consider when modernizing tech stacks and migrating to the cloud, along with the best strategies for banks to carry out a core transformation program to limit the risks involved. And we'll also look to cover some of the big use cases of generative AI in financial services and what the future might hold for the technology amid evolving regulatory landscape and the emergence of new capabilities. That's all to come shortly, but as always, we'll open with our news and number segments. This is where our guest has gone out and found a news story featuring an interesting number to discuss and get us started. So, Zac, what have you brought along for us today?
So one of the things I wanted to highlight is we did a survey of 350 banking executives and talked to them about Gen AI. And what was interesting is 96% of them said that C-level executives and boards are getting much more involved in technology decisions because of the heightened interest in generative AI. And I think that that's really interesting because what we've seen is this progression of technology coming from sort of a separate part of the business to sort of a partnership. And now it feels like the business is really wanting to drive and be a much more integrated. And instead of it being a loose partnership, a much closer, a tighter partnership around decision making. And technology is really being infused into the core part of the business. And core decisions need to be thinking about it as not a separate decision-making process, but an integrated decision-making process. So it's interesting to see how that played out in the data and the survey feedback.
Yeah, there's been so much hype around generative AI over the last couple of years now. I mean, is there that sense then that this is such a revolutionary technology and the possibilities are so kind of vast that everyone feels like they need to be involved in that conversation now and trying to find the killer use cases to drive new efficiencies for their companies?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think with everything that's new, there is definitely hype. And I think that what we're seeing is that this first real year that behind us now was much more around getting POCs and trying to figure out use cases, trying to really understand the technology. I think everybody sees the promise of the potential, but it was harder to get like actual results right out of the gate. And that has to do with a lot of things, but partly in a regulated space like banking, there's a lot of other criteria that you have to kind of use around a lot of governance and other things that you can't just roll things out without having done the proper due diligence. Now what we're seeing is that things are actually going into production this year and we're starting to see results. And I think that like every technology, there is sort of a curve and we're at the beginning of that curve. And I do think that people are still very excited, but I think it's a little bit more grounded in reality now. So I think people are expecting sort of things to be, paced, but it's not like a snap your fingers and everything's going to change overnight moment.
So at Google Cloud Next 2024, then you announced a number of financial services partnerships with the likes of Scotiabank, TD, and Discover. So to get us started, I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about those projects and the work you've been doing there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just backing up, cloud is something that in financial services is now mainstream. We're seeing banks of all sizes around sort of every geography really engaging around cloud technology. some of the announcements that you mentioned with Scotia and TD and Discover are around sort of the data and AI space. One of the exciting ones was around Discover, and really kind of back to your point earlier, like how are we seeing things get into production? What are we seeing results from generative AI? They're using it around their call center and really using generative AI along with search to essentially look at their knowledge management system within the call center of sort of all the information a call center rep would need to know to answer a call, and being able to quickly provide that to the call agent to be able to help customers faster and more efficiently. And that's like a great use case that we're starting to see really gain momentum and really have results.
We'll jump back into generative AI, I think, a little bit later. But one of the big topics that we focus on at FinTech Futures is core banking infrastructure modernization. I recently spoke on the podcast actually with Santander CTO about their core modernization project Gravity, which Google Cloud was involved with as well. I mean, on the topic of, like I say, core banking and modernization, then, I mean, have we reached a point now where the gap between legacy cores and modern cloud native cores is getting so wide in terms of the advantages that all banks still running legacy systems now should be looking to migrate or modernize to avoid being left behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting topic. As long as I've been in banking, and I have a lot of gray hair now, we've been talking about digital transformation. And really, if you think about that journey that all these banks have been on for the last, say, 30 years, it really was extracting out things. So it was sort of middleware services, and then it was microservices and digital front ends. We never went back to address the core, right? And so, the majority, I think it's 44 of the top 50, but the majority of the top banks in the world are still running on mainframes. And to your point, it's starting to kind of break in terms of what you can do and how fast and agile you can be. And when you think about where things are going with AI and generative AI in general, the ability to be able to get to your data faster, to be able to embed that findings, that intelligence, the insights that you get back into the flow of the customer is really, really critical. And I think we are seeing that time, I sort of thought like it might never come, but we're starting to see lots and lots of banks around the world really address this topic and figure out how to do this. Santander is a great example of this, but I think sort of the point is that this isn't going to be a quick transition, but I think it's something that everybody is focusing on, and there's a number of different paths that we're seeing, but everybody is trying to figure out how to make this happen over time.
Excellent. And I mean, given all your experience, and for banks, what would you say are the key points to consider when it comes to modernizing tech stacks and migrating to the cloud?
Well, I mean, we've got the past is sadly littered with lots of failed attempts. There's been some quite famous ones. I think in general, Big Bang doesn't work well in financial services. So I think there's a number of different strategies that we're seeing that are successful. One is kind of hollowing out the core. So taking kind of all of the systems around the core ledger and modernizing those and sort of leaving kind of the actual ledger part on the mainframe to be addressed at some future point. But we have a lot of customers that are going down that road. We have a lot of customers that are building brand new tech stacks from the ground up. And sometimes they're doing that by going to a different geography that they don't do business in today, or sometimes they start like a digital bank in the same geography, but with a different target audience. And that's really about learning kind of how do these modern cores work? How do some of these different technology architectures kind of fit in? How do you apply? And I think one of the big lessons that we see is the way that you use modern technology is not the same as you use on-prem legacy technology. And so you want to take advantages of the things that you can do differently. And so having kind of a test bed where you can do that with real customers and kind of build your way from a very simple, and the complexity here is these systems are hard to replace because we've built so much functionality over so many decades into them. And so it's easier to start with kind of like a pure retail plain vanilla transaction account, right? Where you don't have all of the bells and whistles that a more complex consumer or a more complex business would have. So we're seeing like examples like that of people getting started in different ways, but we're really seeing this momentum now where people are doing this in earnest in lots of different examples.
What would you consider then the biggest challenges for banks then when it comes to core modernization? How have you been working with your partners as well to help them overcome those?
Well, there's the technology piece, and I think that is a challenge, but I think a lot of that has now been solved. That doesn't mean it's an easy path, but I think that it is not a question of if you can do it. It's just more a question of how you put all the pieces together and how you make it work. I think the hardest part is actually around the change management piece and bringing like the organization along on this journey. That means alignment from the top down, but it also means that you have to really get people bought into why you're doing this. So many of the times we see these large technology transformations, this sort of the promise is like it's going to change everything, and people get I think expectations set too high, and then the reality is sort of like something not quite as spectacular, or it dies under its own weight. So I think the change management part of this is a really big deal. Pacing this in the right way, setting the right expectations, and then having the right level of kind of near-term wins along the way so you can prove that things are moving in the right direction. And I think we're starting to see now patterns that are emerging that people are sort of starting to adopt. So I think the very, very early adopters had a much harder path out of this because they were sort of trying to, trial and error a little bit in terms of discovery. But now I think with the number of folks that have done this as a pure fintech play, like the digital native banks, and as legacy banks that have started either hollowing out cores or experimenting with new bank capabilities, I think there's enough now knowledge in the ecosystem that people have a much clearer path of what it was going to be required.
Would you say that composability and flexibility are now key for modern core solutions? What do you think the future holds for the space in that respect?
Yeah, 100%. I think that is so you want flexibility and you want the ability to iterate quickly. So I think that so much of the financial infrastructure is very rigid. And so the future that we're going to is a much more modular, much more adaptive world. And the other part of this is speed. So I think customers and consumers are starting to expect things to be able to be updated and changed and improved at a much more rapid rate. And that includes like new product innovation. And new product innovation is really hard when you're having to go back to a very static core system that is sort of at the end of the day like the kind of anchor to the whole product set. And so I think that is what's driving it. And I think people are starting to see that you can't get to that future without addressing the core piece of the tech stack.
Right. So, I mean, I guess switching back to Gen AI then, how has Google Cloud been working with firms then to help them adopt new Gen AI capabilities?
So, I mean, the last sort of year and a half has been a wild ride as customers have really kind of woken up. I mean, as you know, AI has been in banking for a long time. We've had a lot of use cases around fraud, around customer personalization, around, back office, middle office automation. There's been a lot that has been done with AI. I think what happened, sort of back to the survey question at the beginning that I shared, is generative AI was this moment that kind of woke up the world to the potential of what AI could do. And it definitely woke the business users up to say, my goodness, like we can think about changing how we run our business, how some of the underlying processes are performed, how we reach out to customers and interact with customers. And I think that got everybody's imagination flying. And so I think over the last year and a half, people have really been experimenting like crazy, trying to figure out kind of where the technology is. Now, that's actually quite hard because the rapid change in this technology has been quite incredible, the pace. And so I think people are starting to get to the realization of you need a framework, you need a platform to be able to use this technology because it's not going to be static. You're going to be swapping out models. You're going to be incorporating different aspects of your business over time. So you want kind of an approach or a framework to use and a platform that you can kind of build on. So that's been one big aha that people have really had. I think early days, people went off and did a lot of one-off kind of use cases and then realized it was very hard to scale and kind of keep up in that approach. The second thing is I think that everybody has realized that for the time being, human in the loop is kind of the right approach. And so all of the use cases really go back to how do you make people more productive? How do you give people tools to kind of do their job more effectively? And so the call center example at Discover is a great example of that. That's taking a process where a call agent you're having to constantly train. It's a quite a long ramp period and quite high turnover for that job. And part of the difficulty of that job is, as we've done a lot of the self-service automation on the front end for a lot of the easier stuff, the types of calls that agents get are actually all the hard stuff. And that's hard because most people, until they're a real expert, don't know the answers to all the questions that customers are asking. So they're having to search and get the answers and pull that together to then answer the question. And this is a great use case for generative AI and search, where you can have a massive corpus of data that's just the call center agent data, that's what they would be searching through anyway. Find the answer for the agent and then summarize it in a way that they can then quickly communicate to the customer on the phone. But again, that's a great human in the loop kind of example. And then I would say the third thing that people are really focused on is they're starting to lay the groundwork for how do you think about the model risk management part of this over time. And so today, most of the kind of governance part is the human in the loop. There's other pieces, but that's sort of the primary piece. But in the future and in non-regulated industries, people are starting to go kind of direct to customer with some of this technology. And for that to happen in this space, we really have to think about changing the tooling around model governance. And it has to be a more automated approach. Sort of the model risk management process for legacy, or I now call heritage AI, is there's some things that we can adapt to generative, but there's some net new things that we're going to have to develop to really have this explainability, transparency conversation about how the models work.
Excellent. Yeah, and you mentioned obviously the call center example there, but do you have any other examples of some of the big real world use cases that financial services companies are really trying to tap into there with Gen AI?
Definitely had quite a lot of public announcements around coding. So just the amount of code that sits, legacy code, think about documentation, think about things like looking for bugs in code, all of those kinds of use cases is another big category. And then what I would say is sort of the unstructured to structured data, which is a lot of what I would say is in the sort of middle and back office. Financial institutions are still awash with paper. It's just digital paper. And how do you turn that into structured data? We're seeing a lot of capabilities that people are using generative AI to kind of synthesize large amounts of documents and then summarize that back. So a great example is sort of investment banking research, where people are looking at all sorts of data, and it can be actually call logs as well as paper, and it can be other websites or external sources as well as internal sources and structured data, and giving the ability to kind of synthesize all of that and find out kind of, almost like talk to your data, ask questions of all of that corpus of data. So yeah, we're starting to see lots of use cases proliferate.
And you mentioned obviously the transparency and explainability, some of the compliance as well. I mean, the regulatory landscape around Gen AI is evolving quite rapidly at the moment. What's your take on the evolution of that regulation, and what shape might that take going forward?
Well, I think it sort of goes back to the basics, which is in a regulated space. I mean, the bar is that you have to really understand everything that you are doing with the customer, right? And that's no different whether that's a model doing it or whether that's a human doing it. And so the expectation is that you have to not only have all of the traceability for that, so that you understand, why did we make that decision? Why did we say yes to that loan or no to that loan? Or why did we recommend this product versus this other product? And there's been a lot of rigor that has been built up in financial services over a long period of time about how to do this in different modalities. And in sort of heritage AI, we've actually been able to do this, right? So now it's a question of with large language models, how do we apply the same kind of principles back to those outcomes, so that if a model is making a decision, that you understand, what was that decision based on? Was that and who did you recommend that to? And what was the current situation for that? So a lot of that explainability part of this is going to be really, really important. And then the other piece of this is, when you think about models, you think about the change management aspect of this. These models aren't static. So how do you constantly have a framework that allows you to kind of keep up with the constant changes? And I think that's going to be something there's going to have to be a fair amount of automation there, because the speed at which things are changing is going to mean that I think there's going to have to be sort of almost a separate model that helps you understand the model in a way. So yeah, so those are some of the thoughts, but I think it's inevitable that this is going to have to be figured out, and we're working very hard on a lot of these capabilities from the Google perspective. And I think it's what everybody wants, right? You kind of want the reassurance. I mean, banking at the end of the day is built on trust. That's a fundamental thing. And so you have to be able to understand from that perspective why you are recommending or doing things.
So you mentioned that this is, rapidly evolving technology as well. I mean, what do you think is next then for generative AI in the financial services space in particular? And are there any new developments or use cases that you're exploring at the moment?
I mean, it's a very exciting time to be in this space. I think that there's, I would say, a few trends that we're seeing. First, I think that more things will get into production, particularly some of the things that we talked about in the human in the loop. And I think that will start driving real business outcomes that I think people are going to be very excited about. I think the second is multimodal. We've been talking about this a lot, but the ability to have one model that can basically look at things from a visual standpoint or an audio standpoint or a text standpoint, and be able to kind of bring all of those things together in a much more seamless way. And speed is part of that as well. So doing that in a much faster, much more efficient way. And so I think that there's a lot that can happen there when you think about all of the use cases that are in financial services that draw on that. And then the last one is we had a lot of big announcements at Next about agent. And I think that like what the next step in this process is going to be is action. So help me synthesize, help me summarize, help me find and learn different insights into things, but then let me take action based on that. And I think the agent model is a really exciting next frontier that we're starting to see. And so you thinking about like the ability to, in that call center example, get the answer, but then say it's like the customer is wanting to change their address, being able to then say, okay, great, thank you so much. Like, we're going to change your address, and then have an agent go off and actually work, with all of the internal systems to make that happen. And that's a kind of a basic thing, but like it could be much more complex than that. It could be, a loan, pull together all of the criteria that I need to create an underwriting file for this loan from all these different documents, all these different sources. And then if there are things that are missing in the loan file, reach back out to the customer and ask them for these very specific things that I still need to have in order for me to complete the underwriting process. So I think that those are kind of three things that we're starting to see that get me really excited about sort of the future.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for that, Zac. And I mean, I guess just briefly before we finish, then, are there any other, maybe aside from generative AI, other emerging technologies that you're focusing on at the moment that you think are showing the most potential in financial services?
Well, I think it is the shiny object right now, and we're all really excited about it. But I do think that it's the tip of the iceberg. Like when you think about what needs to go behind that, it goes back to actually our whole conversation, like the data innovation that's happening from a data infrastructure standpoint. There's some really cool things happening in that space. And then the actual core, right? Like the actual core platform of all these banks. Like there's a lot of innovation happening there that's going to be really important, because you really need to think of this as a layer cake, and all piece of this need to be functioning and kind of modernizing. And so I think all three layers, there's a lot of innovation happening. And then security, I think, is the last piece, which kind of wraps around all three of those. I think there's a lot of innovation happening in security right now, and I think that's a really important space. And in financial services, obviously, it's something that back in the days of physical vaults was like near and dear to the industry. It continues to be like a major focus. But how do you use technology? There's a lot of innovation to how to make it more secure, and that's a big topic.
Well, thanks again, Zac, for chatting with us today. To close out the podcast, we have our now infamous Fintech Jails. This is where we ask for an industry term, buzzword, or trend that you've seen or heard enough of. Or, of course, you can advocate to free one of the previously incarcerated terms. So what would be your selection for this week?
So I'm going to go ahead and free cloud. And I know Dirk from Santander put it in jail, but I actually think, based on the conversation we just had today, that cloud is really the enabling fabric for so much of what we're talking about, whether it's a lot of the AI world that is, red hot right now, but no one's going to want to train these models on-prem and all of the compute that's used for all of this stuff. I think the data fabric piece, I think, is huge. This is a multi-cloud world. You're going to want to be able to kind of share data and be interoperable across lots of different platforms and ecosystems. Financial services is very complex, so I think that that's like a real enabler. And then the final piece that we spent a lot of time on today is I think cloud is now mature enough to really help be the kind of enabler for a lot of the tech part of the core banking modernization work that's going on. So yeah, so I would free cloud from the fintech jail.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, given your work, I guess this was to be expected from this one. But obviously, you've discussed a lot over the course of the show, the benefits of the cloud there. We obviously talked about what's next for generative AI, but in the cloud space, I mean, what's next there, do you think, in terms of any further developments that you're working on as well, especially?
No, I mean, I think it's one of these areas where we are in a very exciting moment where financial services, which is predominantly on-prem still, when you look at like the amount of workloads globally, it's rapidly moving to the cloud. And that's very different than some of the other industries that we work with, like retail, for instance, which is predominantly almost all in the cloud. I think it's a really exciting time to be in financial services because I think cloud is this fantastic enabler for something that we've been talking about for as long as I've been in the industry, which is true digital transformation. And I think that the sort of AI piece is, I think, icing on the cake and starts getting it, excited and what the potential can be beyond even some of the things that we were trying to do before. But I think that's my focus right now is how do we transition the financial services world into a much more kind of digitally transformed universe than it has been. And there's been a lot of innovation in the past, but like I said, I think this is like a very exciting time, and I think cloud is going to be the bedrock for making that happen.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I think you've definitely made a very strong case for cloud there. So, as you mentioned, it's going to be a short stay in the jail for cloud, but happy to let this one out this week. And Zac, thank you so much again for joining us for the podcast today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
Well, that's all we have time for this episode. Thanks, of course, to Zac for joining me. As for FinTech Futures, you can find us online at fintechfutures.com, on X at FinTech Futures, and of course on LinkedIn. If you like this podcast and our other episodes, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or your favourite podcasting service to get notified about future episodes. Thanks as well to Arama for editing this podcast. You can check them out at arama.tv. As always, thank you very much for your support. We'll see you soon for another episode of What the FinTech. But until then, goodbye.